Hello, dear viewers. I'm Carrie, and welcome to my channel, ajaneitesews.
You must make haste! Should you think she heard me?
Okay, let's get right to it. Bridgerton is apparently Netflix's most popular show, and I am delighted to see a big budget historical fantasy set in the Regency era because it's my favorite period for historical costuming and the era of my favorite author, Jane Austen. Alert, this video contains spoilers. The first time I watched Bridgerton, I spent most of the time doing three things. One, twitching at the perpetuation of manners and corset misconceptions, like the lack of a chemise. Although the Regency etiquette book, The Mirror of Graces, by a lady of distinction, published in 1811, admonishes readers to wear a chemise, which makes me think some women did not, perhaps like the women in satirical cartoons who are trying to maximize the diaphanous transparency of their gowns by foregoing such important undergarments. Two, exclaiming in delight over the beautiful fantasy Regency costumes. I mean, look at the Queen and that beadwork on Daphne's gown. Or three, hurriedly slapping shut my laptop whenever my teenage son entered the room during the many Bangerton scenes. Then my friend Christine suggested I review the show from the perspective of a Jane Austen scholar. At first I was reluctant to watch again because I get that the producers wanted the actors to be relatable to modern audiences, but what is with the quarantine haircuts? Loose hair equals loose morals, at least in the Regency, and, well, corsets. Then I remembered Pride and Prejudice was published in 1811, the same year the Netflix series is set. I haven't read Julia Quinn's Bridgerton novels, but maybe Penelope and Eloise are reading Jane Austen's novel of manners, making Pride and Prejudice the perfect lens through which I, a Jane Austen researcher, could interpret the manners in Bridgerton. I have a few caveats before I dive in. One, I realize Bridgerton is a modern historical romance and that many of the choices were made to package the Regency for modern consumption. And I am not here to bash it for not getting everything right. Instead, I'll talk about what happened in the series versus in Austen's work, which clearly inspired it and all historical romance novels, and how that helps us interpret the intentional and perhaps unintentional meanings related to manners in what Shonda Rhimes and Chris Van Dusen created. Two, this video is not exhaustive. Instead, I focus on a smattering of topics that jumped out at me, like dancing, laughing, and smashing the patriarchy. Several of my costumer colleagues, like Karolina Żebrowska, Abby Cox, Zach Pinsent, and Costuming Drama, have excellent videos on the costumes and racial implications of the series, and I'll link those in the description box below. And third, I know Jane Austen was a member of the landed gentry, a step down the social ladder from the broad category of the aristocracy which predominates in Bridgerton. But some members of the nobility show up in Austen's novel, like Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And the rules of decorum Austen knew, portrayed, and satirized so skillfully also apply to the uppermost classes. Let's start with introductions. Regency societal rules dictated that women and people of inferior rank could not just walk up to someone and introduce themselves. This is why Catherine Morland and Mrs. Allen bemoan their lack of acquaintance at a public ball in Bath in Northanger Abbey, and why Mr. Tilney has to wait for a master of ceremonies who is there to ensure decorum is observed, to introduce him to Catherine at another ball. And who can forget that scene in the 1995 BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice when Mr. Collins mortifies Lizzie and Jane when he tries to introduce himself to the cold and offended Mr. Darcy. In the novel, Lizzie tries to dissuade him by telling him Mr. Darcy, being superior in consequence, should be the one to begin the acquaintance. But Simon Basset is hounded by mothers introducing him to their daughters in Bridgerton, and it makes me wonder if those mothers were ever properly introduced to him themselves, or if they are just desperate to ensnare him as a son-in-law. Anthony Bridgerton controls which men Daphne can speak to or dance with at her first ball after coming out, because he would be the one to introduce her to them. But he doesn't, and she chafes at this stricture until she quite literally runs into Simon, throws out the rule book, and demands,
Tell me your name. Your name, sir.
Am I honestly to believe you do not already know my name?
Jane Austen and Lizzie Bennet would likely cringe internally at this exchange, but we are not meant to think Daphne unworthy of Simon's notice because she is ill-mannered. Rather, this exchange signals her boldness and admirable quality to us in 2021, and exasperation with her brother's recalcitrance in helping her win the marriage game. Her plight highlights the imperious code of civility to which women, especially, must adhere. She is rescued from her social faux pas by her brother, who properly introduces them, and she can leave the ball secure in the knowledge that she got at least one introduction, although no dances. Next, names. Austen's characters never fail to call each other by their proper names. Miss Bennet, Mr. Bennet, Miss Eliza Bennet, and Mrs. Bennet, etc. Even in her family party at Longbourn with no acquaintance in the house, Mrs. Bennet exclaims,
My dear Mr. Bennet.
and Lizzie calls her father Sir and her mother Madame. I don't even remember if Austen tells us Lizzie's parents' first names. And the Bennets all call their cousin, Mr. Collins, who takes great pleasure in using his patroness's full name in the proper way, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. This is all to say I was flabbergasted during this scene.
You do not understand, Your Grace.
But you call me Simon.
It might seem bizarre to us, but this is not likely to happen outside the home after marriage. Rank was of extreme importance in Regency England, with names declaring the nuances of social status, even within a family. Once Lydia is Mrs. Wickham, she takes great delight in outraking all her sisters. Daphne's hesitation and mirth in this scene tell us she is aware of what is proper, but forgoes propriety because, of course, she is falling in love, and modern audiences want her to call the hero Simon, I assume. Pop quiz, do you know what Mr. Darcy's first name is? Next, let's talk about dancing. The only time young women and men could make sustained physical and eye contact, at least in spurts, under public scrutiny in Regency England. Most dances at this time were English country dances we see depicted in most movie adaptations of Austen's novels, and that historical costumers dance at Regency-themed balls, with the dancers facing each other in long lines and an elaborate, sometimes confusing pattern of movements. It's perfectly possible to create cinematic sexual tension during an English country dance, but Bridgerton ups the ante with something closer to, but not quite, a waltz, where the partners hold each other by the shoulders or the hands and the waist and spin to 3/8 time in a large circle, much like a whirligig. Oh, look, there are even giant sparklers in case you didn't notice the sparks flying. Lord Byron wrote a 257-line poem making fun of the waltz, published in 1813. Endearing waltz to thy more melting tune, bow Irish jig and ancient rigadoon, Scotch reels avant, and country dance forgo, your future claims to each fantastic toe. Waltz, waltz alone, both legs and arms demands, liberal of feet and lavish of her hands, hands which may freely range in public sight, were never before, but pray, put out the light. Methinks the glare of yonder chandelier shines much too far, or I am much too near. And true, though strange, waltz whispers this remark, my slippery steps are safest in the dark. But here the muse with due decorum halts, and lends her longest petticoat to waltz. which echoes a letter to the editor of the Morning Post in 1811 that feared the dance led to, quote, the most licentious consequences. The Mirror of the Graces author went so far as to say of the waltz that there is something in the close approximation of persons, in the attitudes and in the motion, which ill agrees with the delicacy of women. The waltz was not generally thought to be socially acceptable until June 1814, when continental dignitaries made a state visit to London after subduing Napoleon, and of course wanted to waltz with beautiful English ladies. Then the controversy died down a bit. It is important to note that the aristocracy and people in London were always ahead of the times. And there were certainly parties for the upper crust where waltzes were on the list of dances in 1813. The slow dance, almost Dancing with the Stars version we see in Bridgerton, again symbolizes the increasing closeness of the leading characters, showing up even in Daphne's dreams. Marina Thompson is correct when she tells the gross old guy looking to marry her.
Another?
I do believe a third dance would be considered improper, my lord.
Need not continue to prove your virtue to me, my girl.
Miss Thompson, a dance?
Partners often dance 2 dances in a row, and Mr. Bingley shows his preference for Jane Bennet to everyone when he asks her to dance another set with him at the Meryton Assembly, which of course thrills Mrs. Bennet to no end. A third set would be improper, especially as there were usually more women wanting to dance than there were male partners, so men were expected to spread the joy, so to speak. If Marina had acquiesced, she might as well have announced her engagement. Thanks, Colin. Also, even with waltzes, the partners would have worn gloves, leather gloves, to avoid skin-to-skin contact. That was reserved for the liminal spaces outside the view of the public. Andrew Davies' version of Pride and Prejudice, yes, it's my favorite, don't at me, has the youngest Bennet sister giggling, snorting, and slouching throughout to show viewers her silliness and immaturity, so hilariously described by Austen's narrator in the novel.
Colonel Forster.
Captain Carter.
No, I know, Denny.
And since I have had the misfortune to lose him...
Lydia's antics drive her father up the wall, or at least into his library, and embarrass Jane and Lizzie, which indicates their relatively good sense. John Gregory advises young women to stay silent, avoid showing any wit or education as much as possible in his late 18th century conduct book, A Father's Legacy to His Daughters. And through Lizzie Bennet, Austen shows us how to push against this limiting definition of female identity. Among Janeites or fans of Jane Austen, it is a badge of honor to be called an obstinate, headstrong girl. But Lizzie doesn't guffaw or snort, like Daphne does.
Your gown, it is exquisite.
My apologies.
No apology necessary.
Perhaps a small one.
Again, the Bridgerton creators are trying to display the lead couple's blossoming relationship and make Daphne relatable to a modern audience. But snorting in front of the queen? No. No. Next, I want to talk about slouching, which was alarmingly prevalent among the Bridgertons, especially Eloise. Lydia slouches in the 1995 Pride and Prejudice for the same reasons she laughs and snorts. She is 15, a teenager, the baby of the family, and she clearly has permissive parents. Slouching informs the viewer she finds the rules of propriety tiresome and she just wants to have fun. Didactic conduct book authors would call her ill-mannered, to which she probably would have laughed. Eloise and even Daphne consistently slouch on the couches in her family's drawing room, presumably because they are comfortable with each other and usually enjoy each other's company. But busks? Regency stays usually had wooden busks to get that lift and separate look so endemic to this period. And shots of Daphne's stays give clear evidence of a busk pocket. Busks could mold to the body over time, but are not exactly comfortable unless you maintain erect posture. In fact, busks were there in part to encourage straight posture and thus more ladylike behavior. So why is Eloise slouching so much? Maybe she's not wearing stays with a busk because she's not officially out yet, and she doesn't want to be out. Coming out meant a woman became a commodity on the marriage market. And this was a female ritual Jane Austen seems to have had little patience for. Eloise clearly didn't like it either.
And having a nice face and pleasant hair is not an accomplishment. Do you know what is an accomplishment? Attending university. If I were a man, I could do that, you know. Instead, I shall have to stand by and watch dear Mama appear proud because some man should like to admire my sister's face and hair and fill her up with babies.
I think her slouching signifies her unwillingness to travel the same path as her sister, the path expected of her by her patriarchal society. She doesn't want to be shoved onto the marriage market. She even slouches in front of the Duke and her friend Penelope, leading Penelope to slump down too in front of her love interest, Colin. Is Penelope not wearing a busk either? Side note, we have so many back problems in modern society in part because of poor posture. Maybe we all need to be wearing stays with busks. Like most of Austen's female characters, Bridgerton is filled with women preoccupied with courtship and marriage. Some are anxious to find a suitable partner, and others want to avoid the whole ordeal. A feminist analysis of Bridgerton must identify how questions of gender are addressed or ignored in the series and examine the contradictions that gender poses in the different ways the story is resolved. Austen's Pride and Prejudice is not the prim and proper, heteronormative, gender ideal, simplistic romance novel it is assumed to be by many when we look at it through a feminist lens. Feminism here, by the way, is based on the desire to achieve gender equality for all genders and all sexualities. Obviously, in Regency society, the genders were not equal, but Austen reveals ways female characters like Lizzie Bennet can cultivate and assert their identities despite patriarchal constraints. Lizzie defends her sister against Darcy's insults, refuses 2 proposals, stands up to a member of the peerage, and is rewarded for her boldness with marriage to a man she esteems and a much higher rank in society. She gains power. In Bridgerton, Daphne's predicaments early in the show highlight the control her patriarchal society has over young women, the limits it places on their power and agency, almost like we should fear such things in women. There are no dark walks in Austen, but some female characters like Evelina, Frances Burney's famous 1770s epistolary novel, experience a terrifying encounter with a group of men at Vauxhall Gardens, symbolizing the hazards to women of seeking to assert their own desires. Daphne's desperate fear over her reputation is realistic because, as Mary Bennet preaches, that loss of virtue in a female is irretrievable, that one false step involves her in endless ruin, that her reputation is no less brittle than it is beautiful, and that she cannot be too much guarded in her behavior towards the undeserving of the opposite sex. Coming from Mary, this statement at once scorns this construction of female identity, but also acknowledges the lack of alternatives to marriage for most women. Virginity and modesty are coded as purity and innocence, and therefore marriageability. Hence the strict standards of propriety during Austen's time, particularly for women, who were chaperoned when in public and never alone with a man unless it was a close relative. And women were not supposed to travel alone, although Lizzie walks the 3 miles to Netherfield by herself. The patriarchal ideology that classifies women as either praiseworthy, like the Virgin Mary, or blameworthy, like Eve, forces women to push the boundaries of that ideology into the disastrous social situations. Daphne resolves hers by marrying the Duke, but Marina Thompson's search for solutions to her unintended pregnancy out of wedlock lead her through several painful dead ends that highlight the unfairness of a society so lopsided in favor of men. Her situation is terrifying for her once she is led to believe by Lady Featherington that her lover refuses to take responsibility, and not much less so for the Featheringtons who are hosting her in London. Both Marina and Lady Featherington, each in their own way, scramble to find a suitable husband to take her on to avoid scandal. Lady Featherington acts out of fear for her and her daughter's reputations and futures, which explains her manipulative and egregious treatment of Marina, but does not excuse it. She, along with most of London, is steeped in hegemonic patriarchy and blames Marina for her situation, when it is the system itself that leaves unwed and pregnant women of the upper classes without support or understanding. Marina attempts to get Colin Bridgerton to marry her before knowing she is pregnant, thinking he will abandon her if he finds out before they are wed. And can we blame her? She believes he is a good man, will be a good father, and will eventually forgive her for misleading him. Then Penelope, who seems supportive and sympathetic until Marina set her eyes on Colin, betrays her by writing of her pregnancy in the Lady Whistledown scandal sheet. And then Colin lays this gem on her.
You wish to know the cruelest part of your deception. If you had simply come to me and told me of your situation, I would have married you without a second thought. That is how, in love, I believe myself to be.
Thanks, buddy. The Featherington women are looked on with scorn by other women, all for fear for their own reputations, as per the patriarchy, which makes them believe it is in their best interests to shun women who do not live up to men's ideals of proper behavior for women. The whole situation also reveals the lack of support for women by other women, and their entrapment in a system wherein they only gain rank and financial stability through the men in their lives. Except Daphne doing her heroine thing.
And perhaps you might explain to your young ladies, Lady Featherington, how they ended up in such an unfortunate situation and who exactly put them there.
Or perhaps we can make room. I came here to apologize to you.
To me.
I misjudged you, and I wanted to tell you that what you felt you had to do, I understand.
This is great because Daphne is using her power as a duchess to help a woman with less power. But Bridgerton is a modern fantasy version of the Regency world, and Marina is a black woman, while Daphne is white. Daphne gets her happily ever after in the end, while Marina is left with her, well, it could have been worse ever after. Remember what I said about narrative resolution of stories and examining what they tell us about gender in a text? Marina is punished at the end by having to marry Sir Philip, a white savior and a stranger who stepped up against the patriarchy.
Marry you? I do not understand.
After my brother clearly took liberties with your virtue, I would merely be doing my duty.
Good job. While Daphne, also a white savior, is rewarded despite sexually assaulting the Black Duke, reinforcing colonialist and racist ideologies of actual Regency Britain. Perhaps Bridgerton's creators were trying to emphasize Marina's intersectionality, or experience as a woman and a black person, as different and more complicated than the white female lead. But if this is a fantasy world, why not represent a young black woman with a happy ending, as a Bridgerton, or with a lover who returned alive from war to marry her? Representation matters, including in who gets a happily ever after. Again, please watch the Bridgerton panel with costumers of color on Costuming Drama's channel for more insight into race and Bridgerton. Daphne's concern for Marina may seem unrealistic and a bit like tokenism, and it is to a certain extent, but this feminist backlash against sexist and racist norms was building during the Regency. We can see it in Austen's heroines as well as in Bridgerton. Small nudges that would turn into punches, leading to explosions. Small nudges that would turn into punches and explosions, leading to women's suffrage, second, third, fourth, and fifth wave feminism that works towards equality for all marginalized groups. We've come a long way towards gender and other forms of equality, but it is important to examine the past through historical novels like Pride and Prejudice and modern media adaptations and representations of the past to see how far we've progressed and how much farther we have to go. This is my interpretation of select parts of Bridgerton. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video and learned something new, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you'd like to see more Jane Austen historical drama or historical costuming content. Thank you.